Why I sin calu squeeze pat o sin nu yapi squeeze gram o kin sinaichkst tali squeech pskalu hulau o kin suchmat mayan kal sklachat in soch chin sin mat mayaten I kal sklachat in chuichten.
Waid isquis habanat portnioch Dominique or kin Puerto Ricania or kin suchmat maya mos kache in sachchin sin matmayeten or party he sahailwi.
So I always tell people that our school for kids is actually a front for adult language learning. And that's because there's lots of funding to teach kids and there's almost no funding to do adult language learning. And so, half of our program is the school we run for children, but then the other half of our program that is kind of layered under that is teaching our teachers to speak Salish. And so we hire people who don't know how to teach and don't know any Salish at all. And then we spend 3 years teaching them the language and teaching them how to teach. And so, year 4, they become lead teachers in their own classroom. And so that is something that when my parents were starting the school, they visited other Salish immersion schools and they always asked them like, okay, well, how do you bring new teachers to fluency? And these schools over and over again said, well, we don't. They're like, well, what are you going to do in 10 years when your elder retires? And they were like, we don't know. And so they were like, okay. And so before they even started the school, that was their main focus is, well, if we're going to start a school, we have to staff it up. And so in order to do that, we have to create a system that will, take people from no Salish to fluency. And so that's always been kind of the dueling nature of the school where, you're with kids half the day, but then the other half of the day is 90 minutes of professional development where you're studying the language and then an hour where you're doing homework and prepping. And so everybody works that kind of split schedule. So we're kind of double staffed in comparison to other schools, and that's so you can sub out with your co-teachers and you can be in the adult language class while they're with the kids and vice versa.
I guess the other piece that I see about it from our program side of things is that we do these community classes where we're trying to bring in our parents and other family members in the community, friends and whatnot, to try to get people to be hooked on the language. So we don't necessarily see these class times as like in of themselves a route to fluency, but more of an opportunity to say like, hey, there is a place where we're doing this work and it's a carved out space and time for you to practice and get exposure to it. But ultimately, we're really trying to see that as a feeder for getting them to come more deeply into the school. And, we do a lot of hiring from within our families because we think that if we're able to get people not only a community, but also a source of economy, then that kind of helps them to stay in it because a lot more of their foundational needs are met through our school system. So, we have this outside program for adults and, general community members, but it's actually also like a feeder to kind of keep them in more.
We work at Salish School of Spokane, which is a 501c3 nonprofit down in Spokane in the States. And I think we have 65 students this year. We just reopened our toddler room, and so the numbers might be a little off there. And then on the adult language side, we have 25 staff who are in that fluency track. And so we have 10 people who are in the advanced cohort and have already finished the curriculum. And then we have 10 more people who are just finishing up the level 3 curriculum and are new fluent speakers of Insel-Chin. And then there's, 6 or 7 who are beginning or intermediate speakers. And it's been interesting because we've mixed in the high school classroom. We started a high school classroom. And so some of those staff classes also have high schoolers in them. And so that's been a challenge, but also good just to give the high schoolers a taste of what real life is like when it's your job to pass your classes. Our goal is to have our adult language learning program be irrelevant because people start raising their kids in the language again. And so we're hoping for planned obsolescence. That's like our preferred outcome, is that, we get enough adults fluent that when it's time for them to have kids, they raise their kids in the language. And their kids don't need to study their guts out when they're 18 or 30 or 45 or whatever, because they grew up in the language. And so restarting that intergenerational transmission is where we want to go. And so we talk about like, well, part of that is just a numbers game, where you don't know who's going to grow up and marry who, or how many kids they'll have, or if they'll stay in Spokane or move away. And so, we have to build up our programming where, maybe there's 1,000 people who speak in Salish, and then from that, there's maybe 100 who are willing to raise kids in the language. And so, all the things we're doing, are just in a way stopgap measures until we can get that system up and running where, you don't have to learn it as an adult, because we have a language culture community where that's just part of normal life, just like it is, all across the planet, where people have villages and communities where they speak their mother tongue, and then when they go to school or out into the broader world, they speak some other language. But when they're at home with their families, with their people, they speak their own language. And so getting back to that place, I always tell people that the ultimate goal is to, recreate the Winter Village, where it is just this space where you just can live your life in Salish in a meaningful way.
That's what makes our launching a high school program so valuable to us, is that we really see these youth as just being on that brink, right? They're very much entering adulthood, and we want to support them and know that they have a community that isn't just going to say, okay, you got your paper, nice work, see you later, and send them off to college. We really try to maintain relationships with our students and have them know that they have this continued connection to the Salish school and also to other community members that they can speak Salish with. So this way they can always keep it part of their lives, even if they decide that the person that they're going to end up having a relationship with isn't maybe a native speaker. They know that they can still build language skills within their home community, and that they can bring that into their nuclear family life as well. And I think that for our students, they really see that as something that is possible because they have so many other individuals around them that are speaking Salish. They see their mother, their aunt, their grandmother, their cousins. And so for them, they're like, oh, this is actually kind of not that hard to maintain in some ways. Also just the political scene right now is, I think, facilitating that, because you have the Truth and Reconciliation that's occurring in the Canadian government, and that's trickling over into the US as well. And I think that allows the kids to really see like they're in this really poignant time and space, and it really means that they are being supported in doing this work of kind of being more focused on their identity through a language connection rather than just like another form of cultural connection. That language is a really key piece in that. And so that's been something that I've really been trying to kind of, like I said, working with those particular individuals who are just hitting those teens and really thinking about what's that next stage of life for them, and then knowing if they do embark into parenthood, that they have a really strong, solid community base where they can bring their kids in, do language, know that they'll have friends, family who can maintain that with them. It's not just they're in isolation, but they actually are part of a very active language community. Yeah, so it's a living language, not just something that's in textbooks, not just something that you studied for a few years while you were at school, but that it's really part of your lifestyle.
We're at the point now where we're like, oh, do we add staff housing to our school campus? Because right now, at the school, people really do have that sense of community and people stay in the language, but then we disperse across the Spokane metro area. And so we're to the point now where we're like, oh, maybe just increasing proximity is our next step for that, where we try and buy the row of houses behind the school, and we try and just, up the level of involvement that people have. Because people, were forcibly separated, and that's what led to the language's decline, whether it was from allotment or removal. And so bringing people back together and having, more shared Salish spaces, I think is where we're going long term, where it's not just a school, we're thinking like, how do we, have a Salish town in the middle of Spokane that, really encompasses everything you want to do. But in terms of like nitty gritty technical things, we're just trying to keep the school going.
Yeah.
And that's something that with Si'imalau now that she's in West Bank, that's just super exciting because Therese is there at Hua Mening with his auntie, I think, and she was a speaker who just never spoke. But then she said, well, Therese sounded so bad, I thought, well, I can talk better than him. I better stop talking again. And he, she's saying this at a symposium, and he's like, thanks, auntie, But there's, they have 5 or 6 new fluent speakers, and then they have a handful of elders there. And so it's like, oh, that's our next step too, is that, we have to kind of huddle back up with our people, because it's hard when people are spread out all over the place.
For me, I think about it as when you enter into this process, you sometimes I think when people approach language learning, they're just like, I'm just learning a language, and they want to treat it like any other language. Oh, I'm just going to go take some classes, learn Spanish, or I'm just going to take some classes, learn French, or some of these other really, major first language level languages. And it's like, that's not really the case with the Indigenous languages. They've been really beaten and down and suppressed, and we have to kind of recognize that and understand that a part of bringing it back and having revitalization is that it's really a labor of love, and it's gonna really make you at times question your identity, and that's something that we see a lot happen within our community, is kind of like, well, I know I'm already an Indian person, I do these traditional arts, and I do these things with our foods, and I know how to engage in these other pieces of the cultural package. And so I think we have to honor the fact that language is a piece of that package, and then also say, but there's a reason why language is also so important. It's a huge identifier. People, especially in this globalized kind of society that we have, you are able to hop on the internet and acquire dress and, foods and different tastes of other cultures, and it's just all kind of one, right? We're just kind of one mega culture in some ways. And so having the language piece is that really fast identifier, oh, they're Italian, or they're speaking Hebrew, and okay, what's going on, because they physically look very similar to me, right? And so just understanding where does language kind of fall into the whole kind of, like I said, cultural package, and saying we understand it's a lot of work. Language is something that you study, but just like any other thing, right? If you wanted to bead, if you wanted to hunt, if you wanted to take on any other cultural practice, it takes time. You don't come at it being successful right out the gate. But I think that, just also saying we understand that this is something that's a really sensitive, hot button thing for people, and that it's just going to be a place where you are really having to be kind to yourself as well as to others who are on this process, right? On this journey, and just saying it'll take time, but if you're gentle with yourself, it can come, and just like any other skill, it's hours in, but I think for me, knowing that it's this piece that we're also sharing with one another in this way where, we can say oh, ultimately it is a major identifier that will help you to signal to other speakers. And just with the story you're saying, where if you're a speaker in isolation, you're just not going to speak. There's no one to really share that with. And so that's the other key piece, is that language is something that is really a shareable thing, and you kind of need to have people with you to do it. And so it doesn't exist in isolation.
One of the things that really frustrated me early on was when elders would be like, no, that's wrong. And you'd be like, why? And they'd be like, because it's wrong. And like, they wouldn't even be able to tell you why. But they're like, no, that doesn't end until it ends in min. It's a different kind of tool. And you're like, but how do you know that? They're like, because that's not the word. And you're like, but they're both the ending for tool. Like, and that, that just that people who didn't acquire language through study, they don't have to think about the rules and why things are the way they are. Like, it just sounds right or it doesn't. And that, harassing them about it, like, it won't get you good answers and it'll just make them angry. And so like, you just have to like move on with your life. And the reason this came back to me recently is because it turns out that the endings are totally predictable, and that if it is a weak verb, then it has a weak ending for the tool, and like it's just 1-to-1. And so for the elders, it was just obviously wrong, because like in their minds, like, well, it just sounds wrong, but they couldn't articulate why. And that, if you stick with it, those answers will come. But they're not going to come from your elders, because like I said, they don't have to study the language. They already know it. But that if you grind it out, 10 years down the road, you'll be like, oh. And then, once you see the pattern, it's obvious. And you're like, yeah, I mean, I now agree with them that other one is absurd. There's no way it could be that. But in the moment, you trust. Yeah. You just have to go with it.